Hi, Ed.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. How are you today?
I'm great, really. It's a nice day. It's a nice place.
Excellent. Well, welcome to Free Will on Blogging Heads TV. I'm Will Wilkinson at the Cato Institute. I'm actually located here in Iowa City, Iowa. And you are Ed Felten. You're in Princeton, I gather?
That's right. I'm at Princeton University.
You're at Princeton University in lovely Princeton, New Jersey. And it's a nice day out there, you say?
Oh yeah, the fall is the nicest time here, really. All the trees are out, all the students walking across campus. It's really beautiful.
Wonderful. Well, I think I'm actually going to be visiting Princeton in a couple weeks, so I look forward to seeing it. I've never been there.
Oh, it's a really beautiful old campus.
Well, I look forward to it. Enough chit chat, Ed. Let's get into the meat of it. Tell people a little bit about yourself, what you do at Princeton. You're a computer scientist, but you also do policy. So explain your position there.
Well, I'm a computer scientist by background, and I've been on the faculty in computer science here for about 15 years. But maybe 5 to 10 years ago, I started getting really interested as well in the public policy implications of computer science and computer technology. And this was at a time when Washington and other governments were really starting to get interested in technology, seeing technology as a lever that they could use to regulate and act on all kinds of parts of society. And so I started doing work in public policy as well. And now I sort of sit in between the two. Part computer scientist, part public policy person.
Cool. And you just recently, I don't know how old it is, you recently opened up a center there at the Center for Information Technology Policy at Princeton. How long has that been going?
Right. Well, the center's been around officially for a couple of years, but we're really still in a sort of startup phase. The idea is to bring people from across campus who come from different disciplines but have interest basically in how digital technology intersects with public life generally, including public policy and society and the economy and so on. So we're trying to bring people together and have conversations and try to figure out how we can help decision makers understand what's going on and make better decisions.
Excellent. Well, it's one of those areas where it's really it's difficult. It's difficult terrain. It's kind of a thicket of issues that aren't really simple to wind your way through, partly because very few people actually understand the technology, and a lot of them do have interesting policy implications, implications about intellectual property, and implications about privacy. But in order to really understand the policy implications of the technologies, you have to understand the technologies, and the technologies are new and always changing, and so it's difficult terrain to keep track of. So I'm hoping you can help guide me through some of it. Tell me how you got started in this. So the thing when I first heard of you, I think it was about 10 years ago in the Microsoft antitrust case. You were a witness for the government, and I believe what you and your team were showing was that the browser was separable from the operating system.
That's right. Yeah.
Is that right?
Sure. Yeah. So
how did you get roped into that?
I just got a cold call one day from a lawyer at the Department of Justice. And they were looking for someone to give them advice and possibly testify in a trial if there was one. This was well before the case was even filed. I realized after talking to the lawyers for a while that there were some really interesting issues, not just of technology, but also issues about the structure of the markets and issues about how public decisions were getting made that were going to get played out in this technical and negotiation and legal process that went on. And so I was just, even though it might not have been a really smart career move at the time, or it didn't seem like one anyway, I was just too curious that it felt like I had to do it. And so I worked for a long time on the case, and I worked with a lot of really smart lawyers and economists and people in government. And I really got to see in a way that I never had before as just a computer scientist, how these products and these markets and these laws all interact with each other to give us the technological landscape we see. And that was really an eye-opener for me. As you said, during the trial, my main testimony was about questions like whether Microsoft needed to technologically connect the browser to the operating system in the way they did in order to provide benefits to end users and so on. But for me, the real education was in seeing how the technology connected to everything else that was going on. And that's what got me started first in wanting to dig deeper into technology and public policy.
Yeah, as a reminder for some of those out there who might not remember the case, the case was brought on. Was it on behalf of Netscape?
No. The case was brought. The case was brought by the U.S. Department of Justice, acting on behalf of the public.
On behalf of the public. Okay.
Yeah.
But the idea was that the antitrust charge was that Microsoft was attempting to dominate the browser market by linking it to the operating system into Windows, which was, and still is, far and away the dominant operating system. So they were trying to crowd out all the other browsers by sort of linking it. Right. And now, do you think that case was important? Like, what do you think would have happened had either that case not been brought or had Microsoft won? Do you think the landscape would be a lot different now? How do you think that case actually shook out in terms of?
Well, actually, there was just recently a really interesting conference at Harvard Law School on the Microsoft case, looking back from 10 years, from 10 years later, because it was filed about 10 years ago. And a lot of the principals who were involved in the trial came back and had some very interesting talks and panels that were on the record, and some very interesting dinner conversation as well, looking back. And my view of this is that the case ultimately did a couple of things. One was that it established the principle that the laws about antitrust and competition and laws generally apply to technology companies and markets the same way they apply to everybody else. That there wasn't a blanket exemption for Microsoft just because what they built was high tech. And we think of it nowadays as a commonplace that, of course, technology companies are subject to the same rules, even if they should be applied with an eye to what's different about that industry. But at the time, it didn't seem obvious that that was the case. The other thing is that I think that the case played a role in a sort of change in the way Microsoft saw itself and the way that Microsoft interacted with the rest of the world. And at this conference at Harvard, actually, Brad Smith, who's now the general counsel at Microsoft, gave this really interesting talk on this theme, which I found really valuable in understanding what had happened. Now, the case went on for a long time. It ended up getting settled in a negotiation right after 9/11 at a time when the Justice Department felt like it had more important things to work on. So
it really dragged on that long?
Sorry?
I guess I hadn't realized that it dragged on that long.
Well, yeah. So the trial and all the processes around that took something like a year, including some breaks. There were breaks where there was mediation and so on. But and then there was an appeal and there were rehearings and so on. But the case was still open in the fall of 2001, and there was a negotiation that went on, leading to a settlement in October of 2001.
Fascinating. Now, another thing that's about 10 years old, I guess, is the DMCA. Isn't that about 10 years old now?
It dates to about the same time, yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah. The DMCA dates to about the same time as the Microsoft case was filed, actually, both to 1998.
Yeah, well, tell us a little bit about what the DMCA is. If anybody does anything with any kind of media online, it probably affects them. So tell us a little bit what it is, and you've had some run-ins with the law as well. So.
I haven't had some run-ins. Well, let me talk about this. So the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, was passed in 1998. And Congress, I think, in passing it, thought that what they were doing was sort of updating copyright law for the digital age. And it's a big and complicated law, but the part that most people talk about is what's called the anti-circumvention rules. And what they basically say is that you're not allowed to circumvent or work around according to a certain definition, systems that are designed to prevent copying or control access to copyrighted works. Which sounds, when I say it that way, like something that might not be so objectionable. But the problem is when you try to write the definitions and apply them, they end up getting applied to all kinds of cases that you wouldn't expect. So just to give one example, there was a case involving garage door openers, where a company that made replacement remote controls for garage door openers, the little clicker thing you have in your car, got sued by the company that made the original garage door openers on the basis that the replacement opener didn't have permission to work with the software in the opener hanging from the ceiling of your garage, and therefore they were working around this access control system, and that was illegal. So the DMCA, while well-intentioned, has had all kinds of complicated and many, I think, harmful side effects, one of which involved my own research in 2001.
Well, tell us a little bit about that. So there was who was it that sponsored there was a competition to be able to...
Yeah.
What was it? Get rid of a watermark on an audio file or something like that. Who sponsored that?
Well, this was an organization called the Secure Digital Music Initiative, SDMI, which consisted of the major record companies and a bunch of consumer electronic companies and others, and they were trying to figure out, they were trying to find some kind of new copy protection technology to put on the next generation of compact discs that they were going to put out. And so they came up with some technologies that involved digital watermarks, and maybe we'll talk later about what that is. But anyway, the SDMI created what they called a public challenge, where they would challenge members of the public to test out these watermarks and see whether they could be defeated. So a bunch of colleagues and I decided to participate in this, and we found that we were able to defeat all of these technologies. And we did this as academic researchers interested in the state of the art in watermarking technology. So we wrote a paper describing what we had done and what we had found, and then the music industry and the SDMI threatened to sue us, arguing that the paper was a circumvention technology because they said it conveyed information about how to circumvent these watermarks. And so we got into a big legal dispute with the recording industry over whether we could publish our paper.
So the argument was that by publishing an academic paper that contained information about why this how were you saying how to sort of get rid of the watermark, or how to sort of break the little code? Was that part of the paper?
Up to a point. Yeah. So there were really two questions we were looking at. One is, how did these watermarks work? And the other one was, would they be effective? And one of the measures of effectiveness is, would somebody who wanted to remove the watermark because they wanted to copy the music, would they be able to do that? Right. And so we talked about the ways in which, different ways in which someone might try to manipulate the watermark in order to get rid of it. And in the course of doing that, of course, you end up giving hints to people who would want to remove them. And we concluded, and we demonstrated we were able to remove them ourselves. But the industry was unhappy because the argument they made to the court and in talking to us was that we were creating a recipe for circumvention. That's not what we felt that we were doing, and ultimately we won the legal battle and were able to publish our paper, but that only after a significant amount of struggle. Yeah, so
it's just completely baffling. So to me, what the logic is here. So the idea. Let me see if I can try to charitably reconstruct the argument of the other side, which is that we need some kind of a kind of property right protection for people who are the producers of certain kinds of media, and that in order to encourage the production of music, literature, motion pictures, all these things that consumers hunger for. We need to protect the right of the creators and owners of this content from people who would pirate it and be able to sell it for free. We want to be able to make sure that the people who made it profit from it, so that they have an incentive to make it. That seems sensible to me. But then, the next step is that we need to have rules about. So we need to be able to sort of protect digital media in a way that ensures that it won't be copied. And then the next step is that if anybody actually does copy, or if anybody figures out a way of getting around that protection, then they're already violating the right of the producer. Is that the idea?
Kind of, yeah. So, you start with the idea that copyright says that you can't copy creative works unless you have some kind of permission or authorization, either from the copyright owner or from the law, right? Mm-hmm. And so copyright owners who are worried that the internet would make it really easy for people to copy their stuff, which of course the internet does do that.
Which it does, yeah.
It does. They were hoping to be able to design technologies that would prevent copying. But the problem was that they weren't confident that those technologies, anti-copying technologies, were actually going to work. Mm-hmm. And there are deep technical reasons why anti-copying technology is kind of a lost cause in a sense, as an engineering project. And so they wanted to backstop those technologies with law that says that you can't disable them or work around them. But the problem is that when they actually sat down to write a law and define what are the boundaries of what technological locks you can and cannot work around, they ended up setting boundaries that didn't really make sense, and they ended up sort of fencing off areas of discussion and inquiry and activity that were socially beneficial. So they drew the line in the wrong place, even if the idea of drawing a line may have made sense in the abstract.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it seems weird because the anti-circumvention part of it, I mean, as you say, like it's a kind of backstop. So in order to think you need to put that in there, you have to assume that the technology by itself just isn't going to be good enough.
Right, and that's in fact.
But then it seems
happened.
redundant. Then it seems pretty much redundant in a way that all you're doing is raising the cost of copying it rather than preventing it. It seems like you could just stick with a law that says you can't copy it.
You can have a law that says no copying.
You can't. I mean, because if you already know that the technology is going to be broken, it seems like just a superfluous layer of regulation to say you can't break the technology that we know that you'll break.
I think there's a good argument that that's the way it has played out. That these that this law has had relatively little impact on the amount of illegal copying that goes on, but of course you face the full side effects. Law-abiding people who want to do unrelated stuff sometimes aren't able to or have trouble, while the illegal copying is going on anyway.
Yeah. So I mean, what happened to you is an obvious negative side effect that academics who want to sort of discuss with other academics the principles around, say, digital watermarking and the whether it does or doesn't work, they can't, right? So that seems like just a straightforward violation of a kind of freedom of expression. That's big and important. How does this get in the way of things that ordinary people want to do? So people who aren't computer science professors.
Yeah.
So what?
Well,
so what does it do to keep me from doing some things?
So a lot of the digital media that we buy or use is locked up with some kind of copy protection technology. If you buy, for a long time at least, if you bought songs on iTunes, they were locked up with copy protection. There's some copy protection on DVDs and on the next generation technologies like Blu-ray. And all of this copy protection is of course perfectly fine to the extent that all it's doing is stopping you from making illegal copying or redistributing stuff on the internet. But here's the problem. The problem comes when you want to do something that's legitimate, but it's not something that the designer of the technology planned that you would be able to do. You want to be able to you want to be able to take music that's on your iPod and move it to a new iPod. Or you have information that's on a DVD and there's some other legitimate personal use you want to make of it. And this copy protection, this technological lock gets in the way. And now, if you're not careful, you can be in a situation where you're violating the law just by doing something that's perfectly legitimate. So in other words, these technological locks, as they proliferate, start getting in the way, even when that's not the intention of the designer. And so often when ordinary people see the side effects of something like the DMCA, what they see it as is two pieces of electronics that just won't talk to each other. Right? A case where you'd think you ought to be able to transfer something from this device into that device, or you ought to be able to plug your computer into your TV. But it doesn't always work. And sometimes it doesn't work because of good old-fashioned incompatibility. But sometimes when it's not working, it's because there's some copy protection technology that gets in the way, so that one device refuses to talk to the other, mistakenly, if you will, but really in a way that, but even in a case where you're not trying to do anything illegitimate. So it makes it harder for devices to work together. It makes it harder or impossible for companies to make useful products that people would actually want, that have nothing to do with copyright infringement. So it's basically all these side effects around the edge of how people use digital media. And a lot of what ordinary consumers don't have available to them, but would have available if not for this law, you may not even realize that it's missing, except that your life with these technologies is just a bit more frustrating than it would otherwise be.
Yeah. So do you think...
I'm sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
I think you have to be a bit of a techie to sort of understand when exactly these technological problems are biting you, and when it's not something else. But people who are techies tend to be more unhappy about this issue and tend to be more activist about it, just because they know when it's happened to them, and they know what the cause was.
Yeah, and I think it's probably frustrating if you're a techie. You're the sort of person who you're like, this isn't keeping me from copying this DVD, right? I could figure out a way of doing it, despite the protections. So all this is doing is making my life a hassle, making the life of everybody a hassle. If and the thing that Hollywood or the music industry is worried about is that if you get one high quality digital copy out there, then it can be replicated infinitely many times, and so all that work will have done no good. So given that, you've said that you don't think that the DMCA has done much to actually stop the exchange of sort of illicitly copied files. So do you think it's just counterproductive? Is there any way of actually protecting the property rights of producers, or do you think that we ought to change the rights regime because it's just not enforceable given current technology?
Well, I think this is one of the huge questions around copyright and digital media policy. I'm actually more optimistic in this respect than I was before. I think that some kind of reform, some sort of reduction in the DMCA would be good public policy, at least to scale it back to the point where circumventing a copy protection in order for an illegitimate purpose is against the law, rather than all circumventions or nearly all. But even beyond that,
so the garage door makers don't have to, pay their lawyers a lot of money. Yeah. Right.
Well, but even beyond that, there's the question of what the design of copyright or intellectual property is going to look like in the future. And I think a few years ago you would have found a bunch of people who had thought about this issue saying that the current system is really not sustainable, this idea that we're just going to tell people not to copy and that everyone will obey. Because, there are a lot of people who don't obey. And there is a lot of illicit copying that goes on. But I'm actually more hopeful now in this respect. I do think that more people are seeing the benefits of compliance with copyright. And I also think that in the music industry especially, and in some of these other industries, you're starting to see companies, producers, who realize that digital technology is also a huge opportunity for them, and there are new kinds of ways they can build their business that allow them to make money and get back that investment without needing to have 100% compliance with traditional copyright. And I think the more that these companies are seem to be working to provide their product to people in the forms that people want, the easier it's going to be for them to get the public on their side and to get the public to comply. So I'm actually more and more hopeful that there is going to be a good future within the current system, but we're certainly not there yet.
Yeah, I'm one of those people who've always had a strong sense of like I don't. The only time I will like download music that I haven't purchased is if for some reason the format that it's offered in officially is just insanely larded with stuff that makes my life a hassle. Yeah. Right? Like if the company offers sort of just un-DRM'd MP3s, I'm actually quite likely to just buy.
Sure. Well, right. In fact, this was one of the terrible ironies of this approach of relying so much on copy protection, because the illegal stuff that you could get, or the stuff that came off of file sharing networks, that didn't have any of the copy protection on it, and so that could be transferred around, and that could be moved onto your new device, whatever it was. Mm-hmm. And so the effect of copy protection was ultimately that these companies were degrading their own product, but only for their paying customers. The product was still just as easy to use as in the old days for the people who weren't paying. And you're not going to win a lot of customers if your approach is to make your product worse for your customers than it is for people who steal your product.
Yeah, I've started downloading a lot more music since Amazon started offering sort of clean MP3s. That's actually massively increased my paid consumption of music, or at least my purchase of music. Before I was renting it a lot in the sense that I would pay a little bit to take part in some sort of subscription service where I could get streaming something or other. But I wasn't actually buying music because I couldn't have it in the format that I wanted, and I've started. But I'm not sure how much. I'm not sure how much the recording industry or movie makers or musicians can count on. I mean, to some degree, to some extent, I guess I'm altruistically motivated, in that I'm motivated to kind of comply with the rule, even though I could be just taking the music, right? I could be taking it, but I don't. And it seems like a bad idea to really depend on that, even though a lot of people will do that. Sure.
But there are a lot of places in life where we have opportunities to break the rules that most people pass up. Just because we've been taught not to do that, because we think that this is not the kind of the behavior that the people that we are or aspire to be will do. So we have lots of opportunities to commit crimes in our lives that we pass up. And usually without even considering, gee, I guess I could knock that person on the head and take their money. You just don't think that way, at least most people.
Right.
And I think if we can get to that point with respect to creative works, then we'll be better off. But the industry is going to have to win the trust and respect of customers by working hard to give customers what they want. And that's where I think we're starting to see some real progress. And why I'm somewhat more optimistic.
Yeah, I think part of it has to do with just the giving people more of what they want. That if you give people sort of like a crippled product, you can't expect people to be clamoring for it. I think another part of it has to do with the sense of the legitimacy of the right. So people have very strong intuitions about the legitimacy of people's rights to their wallet. So it's very natural for people to pass up the opportunity to steal somebody's wallet if they have it.
Sure.
I don't think there's the same sense or widespread sense of the legitimacy of a lot of copyright and intellectual protection, because a lot of it just seems ridiculous. That I can't.
It does at times.
Yeah, that Mickey Mouse. I can't make a picture of Mickey Mouse and put it on my website or something like that. So some of the laws are so sort of monopolistic and protective and seem just to assure a stream of rents for corporate producers that people just they're like, I don't care about that. I think if you made the right, and so a lot of people react in the sort of extreme way that I think you mentioned, that just to think the whole sort of regime has got to go. But I think you're aiming at something similar to what seems reasonable to me, is that if you have a lot just more modest intellectual property protections that do give producers some monopoly rights for some period of time over their product, but it doesn't seem unreasonable. It's not too long. It doesn't give my grandchildren's grandchildren rights to the proceeds of whatever I might do. Then it will seem just reasonable to people that it would be wrong to steal this piece of music because some guy is really depending on this to make a living.
Sure.
And if it seems like that, I think it's going to be really natural for people to comply. If it just seems like this is just Disney trying to cash in, then not so much. So I think the law is going to have to find an equilibrium that sort of locks in well with people's just considered intuitions about what people's rights are to creative work.
Sure. There is the sense that the law in this area is out of balance and that people will respect it more if it is in balance. And I think that's an area where you can improve. But I think there's also a public perception issue that is more fundamental. And that comes from the way the economics of works like this work. If you look at something like music, right, a lot of the revenue for the music industry comes from a few hits. And people in the industry don't necessarily know who's going to produce those hits. And the result is that if you are a young musician who has high hopes of making a hit, you are facing a lot of economic risk, right? Yeah. And you're thinking about whether to invest some period of your life in making this music in the hopes that you'll generate a hit down the road. So what are you going to do? You're going to go to somebody who has capital, who's willing to make a deal with you where they'll give you some of that capital up front, and in exchange they get an awful lot of the revenue down the road. So that's a perfectly sensible thing to do. But the result is that then if your song becomes a hit, there is somebody who looks more like an investor who ends up hauling in a lot of the revenue. Right? Yeah. A lot of the revenue doesn't go to the artist, and it's a rational economic system. But unless you understand that that person is providing a valuable function by making that investment up front and by spreading the risk and so on, you don't make the connection between these seemingly large revenues to a centralized record company on the one hand and the investments that they're then making in a lot of the young and up-and-coming groups that you like.
Yeah. There's a lot of bands who never would have recorded an album at all, right?
That's right.
If record companies weren't taking chances on finding that next hit. So a lot of the stuff that comes out is stuff that never pans out for the recording industry. It's kind of like it's not that different from research and development into drugs, right? Like you have to spend a lot of money finding one that
and you never know.
That actually works well.
Which is why you don't have individual people in their garages developing drugs, right? It doesn't make sense. You don't have the capital to do it. And so you have these big companies, and the big companies make an easy target. But you have to really look at whether the big companies are necessary, whether the scope of their rights is correct, whether it's large enough to give them the right incentives to actually see these works through, so that we get the drugs or the copyrighted works, the music, the movies that all of us enjoy. But on the other hand, you don't want them to be so broad that it starts to shut down public access or public enjoyment, or even the next generation of works, which get straitjacketed because they can't seem too much like the ones that came before. And that's been a big part of the whole debate around intellectual property policy lately. Is how big should the scope be, and how should the system be balanced? Not so much do we want to have copyright or not, because I think it's pretty clear we do.
Can you excuse me for a second? I think. Hold on one moment.
Okay.
Hello? Sorry about that. I had somebody
That's fine.
back door, so I walked in. So didn't know if it was like a delivery guy or something. Okay, sorry about that.
Sure.
So you were saying that the debate now is about this, like the kind of what the scope is of
what the scope of the system ought to be, right? I think there's a lot more recognition now of the harms that having overbroad copyright or patent or trade secret protection can cause. But of course, the challenge is to actually get to some kind of compromise which is politically workable.
Yeah. So what do you think of the possibility of just technology solving some of these problems itself? So in terms of music, which is, I think that's the one that affects people most directly because, probably more than anything else, music is what's downloaded, illegally. But what do you think of the possibility of sort of just replacing the old distribution and promotion system with just much more direct marketing through? So I know that like MySpace just kind of like rehabbed and put forward a new sort of platform for musicians to promote themselves. Do you think there's going to be a lot more of this sort of direct creator to consumer stuff without the intermediary of a large production company?
Absolutely right. It's gotten a lot cheaper, a lot easier for an individual musician or a band to just do their own production, do their own recording, do their own distribution, and try to build their fan base in a kind of organic way. And that wasn't really possible before, when recording studios were hugely expensive, and it was very difficult to get a record or a CD out into the record stores. That was really the only way you could realistically sell enough units to pay for making it. Nowadays, you see more musicians operating independently, and the musicians and the artists now, in addition, have a lot more leverage in their negotiations with the bigger record companies, just because they have that option of being independent.
Yeah.
And of course, the major.
Go ahead.
And of course, the majors are also working harder to reach directly out to consumers. This is one of the huge benefits that the Internet has provided. The ability to get whatever music you want, whenever you want, if the industry is offering it. And the ability to keep up with the bands or the people that you're interested in. The ability, you can now better find stuff that you're going to like, just because of all the discussion, all the recommendation systems and so on that are out there. So the hope is that we'll have access to more music and better music, and we can actually find stuff we're going to enjoy more. And I think that's pretty likely. And we'll feel like we have a more direct connection with the artists. The artists who have really focused on that, trying to build that sense of connection with their fans, a lot of them have done really well.
Mm-hmm. I've been to P. Diddy's blog, and I feel like he's my personal friend. He puts up these YouTubes. No, just kidding. Okay. Let's talk about we've got the election coming up, and a lot of people use. Some people still go into the old-fashioned voting booths where they do a punch card or pull a lever. But a lot of people have moved over to electronic voting, and sort of one of your sort of notable controversial accomplishments is to hack the Diebold. Is it Diebold or Diebold? How do they say it? Diebold. Yeah, so you were able to, and a team of your students and colleagues were able to get into the electronic voting machine and show that you could exploit it and rig vote counts electronically. So tell us about the security of electronic voting and whether you predict there being any kind of problem with that.
Well, let's see. So the most important thing to know about these electronic voting machines is that they're basically just computers. If you open them up, what you see is something like the motherboard of a PC or something like the inside of a laptop. It's just a computer, and you interact with it via touchscreen or something. But the fact that it's a computer means that it's going to have the kinds of issues and problems that computers have. Sometimes files and data get corrupted. Sometimes it crashes at an inconvenient time. Sometimes it's just weird and you don't know why that happened. And all of that can happen and has been known to happen with these all-electronic voting machines. And so the question is, if we're going to have a voting machine which is a computer and which is storing your votes in this format, in some kind of electronic format, what kind of safeguards are we going to have to make sure that they're working the way they should, or when they don't work the way they should, that we can figure out what happened and fix it? And that's been the big struggle, I think, that's been going on for the last maybe 8 years now around electronic voting. And, of course, you mentioned the research that my colleagues and I did on the Diebold voting machine. And we were, I think, the first independent group to actually be able to get into our lab and analyze a real voting machine of the sort that are used in real elections. And what we found is all kinds of really serious problems relating to security and reliability. So this is an issue that we still face.
Do you think people ought to be worried about that? I mean, like, do you have to be a computer scientist from Princeton in order to figure out how to... So suppose I'm like some, malicious 17-year-old hacker kid, and I can get into the room where the Madison County Election Board keeps their electronic voting machines. Would I be able to actually hack it so that, some random number of votes just goes to the guy that I want?
Well, it would take some amount of technical sophistication. If a person who has the level of technical sophistication to, say, write a computer virus that could spread on PCs probably has enough technical skill to write a vote stealing or vote flipping program and get it installed on one of these machines. And of course, that's not everybody by any means, but there are a large number of people who have that ability. But even if nobody is actively hacking these machines, the fact is that there are crashes, there are glitches, there are discrepancies in results, and if we don't have some kind of protection, then we're really then it's really just a leap of faith to rely on this technology. And we've seen all kinds of instances of problems, large and small, in past elections.
So do you think it would be? Do you think? I mean, it seems like that's just the trend of things. That we're just moving in that direction. Is it bad to be moving in that direction? Should we rely on something more sort of directly physical and analog that's tangible? Would it just be better to stick with punched ballots? Should we not just go in this direction at all, or are there ways of fixing electronic voting so that it is secure and reliable? Is there any future there, or is it always just going to be potentially hackable and therefore, not worth trusting?
Well, I think I certainly would not recommend going back to the Florida 2000s type punch cards. That's not a good technology at all. And I think the question really to ask is not, are we going to use computers in our elections? Because it's pretty clear we are. There are a lot of advantages to having a computer involved. But the question is, what kind of records are we keeping and what kind of safeguards do we have around the computer?
So what do you recommend?
The best safeguard is to have some kind of paper record of each individual vote that the voter has actually seen that is kept as part of the election record. And there are different ways to do that. You can have the voter fill out an optical scan form, fill in bubbles with the number 2 pencil, or put X's in boxes or something, and then scan that with a scanner. Or you can have a touchscreen machine, which before the voter's vote is cast, prints a piece of paper that the voter can look at under glass and say, yeah, that's how I wanted to vote. And that way you have an electronic record. You also have a paper record, and after the election, if there's any kind of question or any kind of weirdness in the electronic results or any suggestion of fraud or error, you can go and look at the paper records. And you can draw a line directly from something the voters saw in the voting booth, this piece of paper, and something that the people doing the recount are seeing during the recount. It's not mediated by some computer technology that is flaky and complicated. And once you have that voter verified or verifiable paper record, then I think a lot of the concerns about electronic voting are a lot easier to handle. And the good news is that more and more places are moving in this direction of having that paper record.
Yeah, so just a little bit of redundancy would help, and just because a lot of this has to do with because it's not something that it could be potentially worrying if you had a virus that you could implant a program that somehow was able to spread to all the other voting machines or something like that, right? That could be a big deal, but it's not. I mean, most of them aren't connected to anything, are they? Are they like?
Well, right. Well, so. Voting machines are typically not connected to anything, but you don't need to have a network connection in order for a virus to spread. The old-fashioned viruses used to spread on floppy disks, right? The idea was you'd stick a floppy disk into one computer and the virus would infect the floppy disk. Then if you put that floppy disk into another computer, the virus would spread from the floppy disk onto the second computer. So it spread kind of virally. And many of these voting machines have a similar kind of setup where there's some kind of removable card or cartridge or something which is programmed before the election with a list of candidates and races and so on, and then put into the voting machine. And after the election is taken out of the voting machine and brought back to some central place so you can tabulate the votes. And viruses can propagate on these cards or cartridges. We found with the Diebold machines that we were actually able to create in the lab a voting machine virus that would spread on these cards from one voting machine to another. Yeah, needless to say, we didn't publish or release that code, but we did demonstrate that it could exist, and we made one just for demonstration purposes.
So that's the case in which it's clearly very, very troubling. But if it's something that's isolated on one machine, it's not. It's a big deal because people's votes should count in the way that they want them to vote. But I think a lot of the worry about electronic voting, short of the kind of situation you mentioned where you can actually have a virus that can spread on these cards, is simply, I think, distrust of the technology, that it seems mysterious. It doesn't seem tangible. But elections have always been hackable, right? In some broader sense, they're socially hackable. Like people give money to people to walk in and vote for somebody. Right. You can have people vote for dead people. You can have people intimidating people from we'll check your driver's license to see if you have any outstanding warrants or whatever. Scare people away from the polls. So the kind of the ways in which sort of elections are hacked that are most worrying. Remain, ones that have nothing to do with, spreading viruses on electronic voting machines.
Well, right. I think one of the key principles in designing election technology or even election procedures is transparency. That you want people to be able to watch and see how things are done, and you want someone who is willing to put in the time to pay attention to be able to know what's happening. So that was one of the great virtues of the old-fashioned ballot box. Often they were made out of glass, and you could just sit there all day and watch it. And you could know that exactly who had approached it. You could know that it was really empty at the beginning of the day because you could just look and inspect it. And when you move to technology, you lose that sense of transparency. It's just a sealed plastic box, and inside it has some kind of records of what happened. But you can't look at that and just know that it's going to work the way you want. And you can't even open up the lid. You open up the lid on your PC, what you see is a bunch of, a green circuit board and a bunch of gray chips, and all the action is happening at a tiny microscopic level that you couldn't possibly hope to see it, and sealed inside plastic, another layer of plastic anyway.
The files are in the computer.
Yeah.
You know that part from Zoolander where he's like, beating the computer
Oh,
to
yeah,
try
yeah,
to get the
right.
files out. Yeah. You
That's
can't
right,
do
it's
that.
in there
and
somewhere.
That's the problem, right?
You can't look, you can't
not in
write,
there.
you can't really inspect it. All you can do is ask the system to report to you what's inside it. And if you're
Yeah.
not sure that the system is working right, that's not very satisfactory. You don't have to be a computer scientist really to know that. Anyone who uses computers very much knows how frustrating it can be to not understand what's going on, and to really not have the tools to figure out what's going wrong. And you don't
for
want to
me
be in that
it's like
situation.
magic. I just count on magicians like yourself to make sure that everything works correctly.
I often
trust.
tell people, as a computer scientist, the difference between me and the average user is I know why it doesn't work. I can't make it work necessarily, but I know what went wrong more often.
Well, let's talk about a slightly different kind of transparency that I just looked at a paper that you'd written with some of your colleagues about the access to government data.
Yeah.
Right? The government, the U.S. government, produces gigantic bodies of data. There's I don't know if there's any institution of the world that gathers and captures as much data and publishes as much information as the United States government, but it's impossible to get to. So you were arguing in your paper, Government Data and the Invisible Hand, that the government ought to be doing a lot more to make its information available and searchable to the citizens who pay for its gathering.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about the principles that you have in mind when you're talking about the way the government displays and makes available its information.
Sure. So we argue that not only that government should do more, but that that it should do different things than it's doing in this in order to make its data available. That government should not be trying to build the one big portal to government data, which is kind of the be-all and end-all of citizen access. But instead what government should be doing is trying to make the data itself available to people in a manner that is as sort of straightforward and reusable as possible. What we've seen in a lot of areas is that government publishes some data, and then you have somebody outside the government, whether it's someone in the press or someone at a university or just some individual who's really interested, who goes and writes a computer program to suck down that data across the net and then represents it or reanalyzes it or makes it available in a new kind of way. And it's that kind of mixing and matching, that mashing up of the government data that is really interesting, and it's happening outside the government. And so what we argue is that government should think of its main goal as facilitating that kind of private sector, non-governmental use of data, and government should measure its success by how much of that happens, and it should publish data in formats that are open and are really designed to facilitate that kind of private access. So even if nobody goes directly, even if ordinary citizens don't go directly to the government to get information about what the government is doing, government can still be very successful if it creates this rich marketplace of ideas in different ways of analyzing, presenting, and discussing government data. So anyway, so that's our idea. We call it government data and the invisible hand, the idea that we want sort of the desires of people outside of government to be driving how this data gets used, and the government to be the facilitator.
Yeah, because there's really no reason to think that the government is going to do an especially good job of presenting the data it has available to people in the form that they want it. They have really no incentive to do that. And whenever the government does it, it's because like some department got a little bit of a grant, so they create a website which then becomes superannuated within a couple of years, and then they never update it, and nobody knows how to use it. And it's just like it's almost always just a waste of money when the government tries to kind of create these portals themselves. But they could be just making everything available in really standard file formats. In these repositories that anybody can sink their, just suck it up through their straw and present it any way they want. that's how it's going to be most useful. That's the idea.
Sure, and that's the idea, and it goes even beyond. I think our argument goes even beyond the question of whether government can institutionally build a sort of up-to-date, modern, and useful web presence. In a lot of these areas, we don't know. We can't say in advance really what's going to be the right way to present this data, and so we want to let different people try different things. Just like in the private sector, we want there to be competition between different organizations that are trying to figure out how to present this data to citizens in a way that's useful. And the way to enable that competition is not for government or anyone to build the one system, but to put the data out there, make it reusable, make it easy to mash it up, and then let creative people outside of government do what they do. And we've seen a lot of interesting things get done in that way, even in today's world where government isn't working particularly hard to facilitate that.
Yeah. So what are some good examples of that?
Well, let's see. One good example actually had to do with what's happening inside Congress. Back in the 90s, there was a site set up called Thomas that was run by the Library of Congress that made available on the web information about the text of bills as they were introduced and information about their status and so on. And it was, for the time, a reasonably good website. But it didn't get updated, and over time, it really was not up to date. And so a bunch of people, but in particular a guy named Josh Tauberer, who is a graduate student in linguistics at the University of Pennsylvania, decided that they wanted to build a better site. And so they would build sites that would go to Thomas, it would download everything on all the information they could get off Thomas and strip off all the government formatting, and then represent it to people in a new way. So you could say, you could subscribe to an RSS feed for all the bills about some topic. You could get notifications every week of what happened to some set of bills that you put on your watch list. You could get information about the voting records of the people of the representatives in your district or elsewhere, and so on. And all of this stuff was available because what Josh had basically done is he had taken the information published on Thomas and he had ripped off all the government formatting and turned it back into the kind of format that that we're advocating government should be publishing in the first place. And he then took his sort of stripped down simple data and made it available to others. And so we've seen this proliferation of other sites that let you look at things happening in Congress. And so, for example, there are sites that you can look at. You can look at timelines that correlate the donations to different lawmakers against how they vote, what bills they introduce, and so on.
Right.
An obvious kind of thing for citizens to want to look at, but what that requires is somebody get the idea to do it, that they get one data set about the progress of bills and votes in Congress, and they get another data set about political donations, which comes from another place, and they be able to get these and bring them together and then try out different kinds of visualization. So once you open up this kind of experimentation, people do great things. And that's what we hope will happen all over the place.
Well, do you find that there's, very much resistance to this? Because like that example that you mentioned, let's have something that correlates donations to the kinds of bills that congressmen introduce and vote for. Congressmen are bound to not like that very much, and then even bureaucracies, the various agencies of government, a lot of them are quite invested in having control over the use and transmission of the information that they have available, that a lot of their power has to do with their ability to filter what the public gets.
Right, and often...
So a lot of democratic government is just like one giant principal agent problem, right? Where the government is supposed to be the agent of the people.
Yes.
And we, the principal, give them a lot of money to act on our behalf, but their interests often diverge from ours, and so they're off doing whatever it is that they're doing, and their ability to continue doing it depends on a certain level of opacity. So if you introduce transparency, it's really annoying to the people who are supposed to be our agents because they can't exploit us in the same way. Obviously, that would be good if we could do it, but is there... but of course, these very same people have to approve, these changes in order for them to take place. So, do you think they're inevitable, or bureaucracies and legislators are going to throw up roadblocks?
Well, it's not inevitable at all that this is going to happen. It requires a certain amount of political will to make it happen. That ultimately has to come from the public, right? We have to use some of our ability to make our representatives accountable to convince them that this is something they should be doing. And we're seeing some indication of this. And we're seeing, the government doesn't act as a single entity. Where you have disagreements within the government, sometimes one of the parties to that disagreement will push for a kind of transparency to make in order to gain some advantage. And to the extent that they're providing more transparency, more information to the public, then we should be in favor of that. But it's true that often there are institutional reasons why various actors in government won't want this to happen. And so, once you establish what's the right way to do it, you still have a political struggle to get them to do it. Although I think we may see some instances where things happen that are really popular because they give citizens more of a sense of ownership over what's happening, and and an agency, I think, can get some sympathy from the public by to the extent that they provide data that's actually really useful to people.
Yeah. I understand there's a big difference between some of the agencies. Like some you file a FOIA request, you get the thing you requested very quickly. I mean, it seems sort of weird that you need to file a request to have access to this information, because if it actually is just public information, we shouldn't have to you shouldn't have to actually file a request and have them mail it back to you. You should be able to just push a button. So some agencies are good about just whatever you requested, they send you the papers. But other agencies, you file a FOIA request, they lose it. You file it again, you have a lawyer call them, then they send you what you wanted with a bunch of stuff redacted, but it doesn't actually have any real legal status for confidentiality. So you have to, and so you go back and forth and back and forth. And I guess my hope would be that this kind of thing would reinforce the norm that government information is in the public domain, and the public should just have access to it unconditionally, unless there really is some giant national security matter at it,
Well, there's, in something like the Freedom of Information Act, there's a set of enumerated reasons why government is allowed to keep some information secret. And this makes sense, right? Information that is private, private information about a citizen, some information related to national security. To the extent government is in a business deal with a private company and there are trade secrets of that private company, you can understand why government would want to be able to promise the company that they're not going to blab all that information to anyone who asks. So there are good reasons sometimes, but it's true that there's a lot of institutional resistance often to getting this information out. And some of this has to do with the kind of mismatch between the way that we used to think about information dissemination and the way that we tend to do it now in the Internet age. Right? So in the old days, it wasn't even remotely feasible for government to make available to all citizens all the information about what it did. That's just too much information. The books you'd have to print it in would be too big, and people wouldn't want to have them. But now with the Internet and the ability to publish huge amounts of information and make them available to the whole world cheap, you don't necessarily need a Freedom of Information Act request to inform the government that it might be worth the trouble of publishing some information. Right now, an approach of publishing a lot more automatically becomes possible, and then you have the public policy question and the political question of what will be published and what's going to happen to make that be published in a useful way. A problem that you didn't quite have in the same form before. Yeah. Well, I think we've run out of time, Ed, but thanks so much. Let's get all the information free and hope that nobody, hacks all the voting machines for the election. But this has been incredibly informative to me, and thanks so much for coming on. Thanks. I enjoyed it. All right. Well, take care now. Goodbye.